Are we ready to roll? Okay, good. Love it. Good evening and welcome to the 7th Jurist in Resident program at the College of St. Rose. I'm Marcia White. I'm the 12th president of the College of St. Rose. I am a proud alumni of the class of 2000. I'm also a trustee, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm thrilled we're all here, live and in person this year, after missing in 2020 for obvious reasons. It's wonderful to see you and welcome you all, and those that are watching on Facebook and YouTube as well. The program this evening is entitled, can I say that? Free Speech in Education. It is timely. It's a timely topic for many reasons. We've assembled an impressive panel of guests to share their different perspective on the first of the 5 basic freedoms protected in the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. First, some background. The Jurist in Residence program is associated with our pre-law program and the Prescott mock trial team, named after our incredibly accomplished alumna, Judge Loretta Prescott, graduate of the class of 1970. Loretta was the catalyst to establish the National Collegiate Prescott mock trial team, as well as the construction of the Honorable Loretta A. Prescott, class of 70, mock trial courtroom renovation project on campus. Each year, the judge spends time with our team reviewing their strategy for the case that will be argued in the national competition, and she leads the Jurist Residence program. Before we introduce our panel, I am pleased to continue the tradition of recognizing the outstanding students who are members of the mock trial team. Would you all please stand? Woo! Bravo. Thank you. Very proud of you. And team coaches, Professor Al Chapeau, as well as Taylor Bashford, class of 2019. Please stand. Our coaches. Al is an attorney and associate professor in the Criminal Justice, Behavioral, and Law program. He has been devoted to coaching and mentoring the students of the teams since the beginning, the very beginning of this program. Taylor is a practicing attorney and adjunct professor here at the college and a former team captain. In attendance are 2 former team co-captains who graduated in 2019, and if they would stand, Rebecca Velez, and who is currently attending Villanova Law School and interning at the DA's office in Philadelphia. And Megan Hardy, who is currently attending St. John's University Law and externing with a judge in the Southern District of New York. Welcome back, Becky and Megan, and best wishes for your continued success. Right now, we have mock trial team graduates attending law schools in St. John's, Villanova, Albany Law School, Emory, the Syracuse University. Former students have graduated from law programs at Pace University, the University of Southern California, University of California, Hastings, William and Mary College, and the University of New Hampshire. For the thought leader on the program, I would like to introduce our inaugural Jurist in Resident, Loretta A. Prescott. She's a senior judge for the United States District Court in the Southern District of New York and a 1970 graduate of St. Rose with a degree in chemistry. She joined the court in 1992 after being nominated by President George H.W. Bush. Loretta became the Chief Justice of the court in May of 2009 and served as Chief Judge for a 7-year term before taking senior status in 2017. She graduated from Fordham Law in 1973 and from New York Law with her Master of Law degree in 1978. She was a commencement speaker and received an honorary degree from Fordham University Law School in 2016 and received the University President's Medal in 2018. Now, time does not allow me to share with you the judges' awards, far more numerous to really provide the details. As we are covering many other issues over which she has presided, many cases, I will now turn the program over to Judge Prescott to introduce the panelists and thank you for joining us this evening.
Foundation of Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. Will began defending student and faculty free speech in 2006 for FIRE after graduating from New York University School of Law, where he served as executive editor of the Law Review. He's appeared on national cable television. He has been published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. He's admitted to practice in New York and Pennsylvania, and is a member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association and serves as co-chair of the Education Subcommittee of the American Bar Association's section on administrative law and regulatory practice. Will you help me welcome Will Creeley? Dr. Alice Green is Executive Director of the Albany Center for Law and Justice, a civil rights organization she founded in 1985. The center provides community education on civil and criminal justice, legal guidance and advocacy, crisis intervention, community planning, and organizing around criminal justice, civil rights, and civil liberties issues of particular concern to poor communities and those of color. She has a doctorate in criminal justice and 3 master's degrees, education, social work, and criminology. Alice is an adjunct professor at State University of New York at Albany and has also taught at Russell Sage and Siena College. She's a member of the Board of Directors of the New York State Defenders Association, the Vice President of Senior Hope, an alcohol and drug counseling program, and a member of the Albany Advisory Board of the Capital District Chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union. She's a founder of the African American Cultural Center of the Capital Region, and for 20 years has worked as a prison volunteer. In recognition of her work, Dr. Green has received awards from numerous organizations, including the NAACP, Rockefeller College, the National Organization of Women, the New York State Bar Association, and the Excellence Award from the College of St. Rose. Would you help me welcome Dr. Alice Green? Dr. L. Oliver Robinson, Superintendent of the Shenandoah Central School District. In addition to overseeing one of the largest public school districts in the Capital Region, with 12 schools and approximately 9,800 students, Oliver is Vice President of the New York State Teachers Retirement System Saratoga Chapter of Commerce, Chamber of Commerce, forgive me, and the New York State Education Department Commissioners Advisory Council. Would you help me welcome Dr. Robinson? Now, over the past few years, this program has looked at several important topics, from global commerce to government ethics. But this year's topic is on something very important, the First Amendment, and more especially how it affects the marketplace of ideas on school campuses. Our country is like none other on the planet. America is the only country bound together not by ethnicity or geography, but by ideas. Our founders brought forth on this country based on the idea that the people have certain inalienable rights. And when they enumerated exactly what those rights were, the first ones included freedom of speech. Before the formation of our country, both the speech and press were suppressed in English society. The laws of seditious libel made criticizing the government a crime. An elaborate system of licensing prohibited publishing without government approval. The colonial experience was not so different. During the 17th century, the government exercised stringent control over speech deemed blasphemous to religion. And in 1735, John Peter Zenger was infamously tried for seditious libel in New York after publishing criticisms of the government. At that time, unlike today, truth was not a defense to a libel action. But Zenger's defense counsel convinced a jury to return a verdict of not guilty based on the truth of the criticisms of the governor. Cato's letters, written by British writers and circulated throughout the colonies before the Revolution, sparked many of the ideas that influenced the foundation of our democracy. Number 15 focused on the value of free speech in preserving liberty, and it said, "Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man, as far as he does not hurt and control the right of another, and this is the only check which it ought to suffer, and the only bounds which it ought to know." Does that sound familiar to all of us? The First Amendment states in its entirety that Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And although we know these constitutional provisions were put in to prevent the sort of government overreach that we saw from England on the colonies, there are a series of views that illuminate the importance and the necessity of this right. First, many have noticed that free speech is the finest way to discover truth. When discussing the marketplace of ideas, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in 1919 that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of ideas. Next, freedom of speech is crucial in self-governance in a democracy. Open discussion is essential to hold officials accountable and to inform the voters of their choices in an election. Third, freedom of speech is often understood as an essential element of autonomy and personhood. As Thurgood Marshall wrote in 1974, the First Amendment serves not only the truth of the polity, but also those of the human spirit, a spirit that demands self-expression. Lastly, freedom of speech is a means of promoting tolerance in society. And that means tolerance of all thoughts, even those that you disagree with. The founders did foresee a danger lurking in all this great freedom. So perhaps presciently, James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson, "In our government, the real power lies in the majority of the community, and the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended not from the acts of the government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of its constituents." He referred, of course, to the tyranny of the majority. And since the founding of our country, the tyranny of the majority, and in some cases, the tyranny of a very vocal minority, has often pushed back against our fundamental free speech rights. The Supreme Court of the United States has decided dozens of cases defending the First Amendment, but often the most difficult and challenging ones involve the free speech of students. So as college students, you know the importance of building a community of ideas, where ideas and opinions are freely shared. However, achieving that marketplace of ideas has never been simple. The First Amendment applies to states and their institutions, and accordingly to public universities, elementary schools, and secondary schools. Those schools may not infringe upon their students' free speech rights. But how much can these institutions restrict free speech? In a case called Tinker, the Supreme Court took up its first major case involving the free speech rights of students in public schools. There, a public school district suspended a group of high school students for wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War because that act violated the school district's newly adopted policy. I know, by the way, it's difficult for you to believe, but when Tinker reached the Supreme Court in 1969, I was studying here at the College of St. Rose. The Supreme Court held that the suspension violated the First Amendment, recognizing for the first time that First Amendment freedoms extend to student speech in public schools, and that pure speech, that is, speech that does not disrupt any of the activities, is traditionally given the most robust protection. The court stated that if a school can show that student speech might reasonably lead to a substantial interruption of school activities, or actually cause disorder, then the school might be able to regulate the speech. Nearly 2 decades later, the court took up another case, again in the high school setting. In Bethel School District, after there the student had been suspended for using a rather elaborate and graphic sexual metaphor in a speech at a high school assembly. The court found that the school may regulate vulgar speech and noted that the aim of the public school system is to create good and civil citizens, and that crude speech is simply incompatible with that goal, particularly when you have, Dr. Robinson, 14-year-old freshmen in the audience. In 1988, in a case called Hazelwood, the school removed from the school-funded newspaper stories about divorce and teen pregnancy. In the teen pregnancy article, although the students' names were not mentioned, there was credible evidence at the trial level that they could be identified. The article discussed the girls' sexual histories and their use or non-use of birth control. In the divorce article, the student was named, and she called her father out as being an inattentive parent. None of the other actors in either one of those stories was given a chance to respond. Because the newspaper was published as a part of the journalism class, under the supervision of a teacher, and ultimately the principal, and therefore had the school's imprimatur, The court found that the school could set reasonable standards for student speech consistent with its pedagogical function. In 2007, in a case called Morse, the court authorized the disciplining of a student who, at a school-sponsored function, unfurled a banner that said, "Bong hits for Jesus." Now, nobody would argue that that banner was thought to have the school's imprimatur, but nevertheless, the court found that it could be sanctioned, consistent with the school's pedagogical role in discouraging illegal drug use. This past June, we had a new case solidifying the First Amendment rights of students off campus. That case was called, I can never pronounce it, Mahanvoy Area School District. There, the court held that a public high school had violated a student's free speech rights when it kicked her off the cheerleading team for sending an off-campus Snapchat message. I understand Snapchat to be something that disappears after a while. It contained, shall we say, vulgar language, which criticized the school. Essentially, she used the F verb with respect to softball, cheerleading, the school, everything. But the court said that school was not allowed to sanction her. First, the court reaffirmed Tinker, saying that schools could regulate on-campus speech that materially disrupts classwork, etc. The court also noted the special characteristics of the school environment give schools license to regulate speech and are not necessarily inapplicable to off-campus speech. But because the cheerleaders' posts were outside of school hours, did not identify the school or target any member of the school community with abusive language, and did not otherwise disrupt the school's functions, the court found that that speech was protected. So the court has pretty clearly spoken about the First Amendment in the primary and secondary school environment, but it's only decided a few cases involving college students. Healy v. James in 1972 held that a university president could not refuse official recognition and the benefits that went with recognition to a student group which wanted to start a chapter of the Students for Democratic Society. That was back in my day. SDS started as a kind of like socialist and became a very radical anti-war group. They said, we don't care if you don't like their views. They're not disrupting anything, and you can't fail to recognize them. In another case called Papish, a student was expelled for a newspaper article that used indecent language and had a cartoon of police officers raping the Statue of Liberty. Court said, I'm sorry, it's not obscene speech, and Healy said it can be indecent, it's okay, so that was allowed. In 1995 in Rosenberger, the court held that denying funding to a journal that advocated Christian viewpoints was unconstitutional, saying that the university may not discriminate on the basis of viewpoint when the subject matter is otherwise within the boundaries of the publications. So where does that leave us today? Well, there are plenty of unknowns. On one hand, the Supreme Court has made it very clear that First Amendment protections for student speech plainly extend into the school environment. And the cases brought by high school students, as you can hear, are a mixed bag. But every free speech case brought by college students, the court has given a victory to the college student. So we seem to know now that a student's First Amendment rights at a university are pretty close to, if not coextensive with, the rights of anybody else. Now, as I mentioned earlier, First Amendment only restricts state action. So First Amendment free speech rights apply only to students at public universities. What about private universities like Pat and my beloved alma mater, the College of St. Rose? What course does a private school student have? Well, seems not much. And the result is that even at some private campuses, the rise of cancel culture has taken control of the marketplace of ideas. Recent examples are plentiful. This year, the student staff of the Duke Law and Contemporary Problems Journal resigned after the school refused to pull an article written by a philosophy professor who shared her anti-trans views. Also this year, Brandeis University's Park Center published its oppressive language list, highlighting words that students ought to avoid, like prisoner, spirit animal, crazy, and even trigger warning. And violation of free speech rights do not seem to be tethered to one political view or another. This June, a Stanford law student learned that the university was holding his degree after he mocked up a satirical flyer directed at the Federalist Society. Ultimately, after national pressure, including from Will's organization, FIRE, the university reneged. Students subject to discipline at private universities had little success in the court. Even at so-called liberal arts colleges, which advertise themselves as being bastions of free thinking and diverse ideas, and they unabashedly stifle free speech. When tested by the courts in cases involving public schools, however, cancel culture hasn't made out very well. In recent years, courts of appeals have upheld a professor's right to reject a student's preferred pronouns and the right of a fraternity to dress in blackface. But the courts of appeals have rejected a public university's requirements to provide notice before speaking on campus, and a university's eliminating all funding for print media in reaction to a student newspaper's publishing an article satirizing the concept of safe spaces. So, with that little introductory tutorial, let's go to my friends, my student friends in the audience. Why are freedom of expression and academic freedom important on campus? Or do you think freedom of expression and academic freedom is? What do you think, my friends? Is that an important value? Is that important to you in your education? Don't look around, put your hand up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I do believe it's important in a school to have a free exchange of ideas in order to vote. A lot of our classes in a liberal arts school are focused around discussing and interpreting our fellow classmates' opinions. And it's extremely important to have an open space in which you can say your opinions to learn from that of your students. If we are unable to freely voice our opinions, then they are restricting our ability to learn within those classes.
Who else? Thanks for doing that.
I think it's really important because as higher education, you're here to learn about how, law. Most of us here are here to learn about law. And learning about it is one thing, but you're also supposed to interpret it in your own opinion, in your own voice. And if you can't do that, then there's really no point in learning about it, in my opinion.
And does it help you to do that when you hear views that are agreeing with yours and disagreeing with yours?
It's helpful because if you don't have ideas
Who else? Panelists, what do you think? Do you agree with what these students have said? Do you have something you want to add? What do we think? Alice?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know how, am I supposed to use this?
Sir, could you help Dr. Green, please, with her microphone? Thank you, sir.
It's on, right?
Belt it out.
Well, just one thing I want us to recognize, and that is a college is not a closed institution. And what you do here doesn't stay here. There's a cross-fertilization that goes on with the community. So when something happens in a college setting, we know about it in the community. So if you want to be a part of a community, if you want to learn what it's like to be, interested and concerned about civil rights, you have to recognize that that community is going to act on some of the things that are going on here on the campus. And I think with a lot of the cases that you talked about, they certainly took place on a college campus, but certainly in the community, they heard that message, and they also wanted you to be a part of that community. So let's not think of this setting as something that happens one place and not another, because it spills over. And the same thing happens in the community. What happens in the community, of course, spills over into the college campus. So there's that cross-fertilization going on that we have to remember.
Oliver, what do you see in the elementary and secondary levels?
So just to comment briefly on the higher ed, I think the distinction, if you will, between, since I'm the only person sitting over here, hopefully I'm not violating your mass protocol. So it's great to be by yourself, right? You can have the freedom to show your face. I think the distinction in many ways in terms of, say, university setting is largely seen as a place where adults are present. And I'll just give you a perfect example of that. As a father of a child in college, I can't get a single piece of information about my 19-year-old kid who I pay $65,000 a year for, because that child is viewed as an adult. And subsequently, the standards are different versus in a K-12 setting where the standards are, in fact, where we have, if you want to say greater control, if you want to use, or constraints, if you will, surrounding speech. With that being said, that's a difference, I think, why certain things are more allowable or not. However, I think the commonality that binds both settings together is that the allowance of speech and how we control or not control it lends to what we think fundamental education is supposed to be about, fostering an environment where inquiry thrives. And so having students having a sense of voice lends to ultimately students having a sense of agency. The question then is, how do we do that within the academic realms, which the university and or the K-12 setting stand for? So from a student perspective, we have courses that debate national issues and bring the issues of the world to the classroom, but in a way, in a context that it becomes a learning experience and not necessarily a debate of individual personal biases or preferences or otherwise, versus, as you mentioned before, contributing to that marketplace of ideas that subsequently lend to increased learning and ideally better understanding of each other, because ideally it's what we want to create, if you will, using that term, young people who truly do have an appreciation of the wide differences that exist in society. So there's a place for it for sure, in terms of, the question is, how do we start splitting the hairs of when and what type is appropriate? And I think that's where you, as I would say, that's where we call our attorney, to decipher that next step of the phase.
I want to recognize a renowned education attorney sitting here right in front of us. This is Beth Barassa. Just let them know who you are. And she represents many of the schools in this room. So Will, what do you see when you're arguing these cases? What kinds of things do you argue in favor of freedom of expression and academic freedom on campuses? What are the values?
Well, that's a great question. I just want to say it's an honor to be here, first of all, so thank you for having me. There are a lot of ways to approach that question. I think to echo Dr. Robinson's good point about the commonality between K-12 and the higher ed realm, and also Dr. Green's point about community, I think the through point is the idea of students as individuals who are seeking truth, right? The University of Wisconsin has got that great phrase about sifting and winnowing. That is, you're sifting and winnowing through ideas to construct your own identity, your own personal sense of truth, not through indoctrination or top-down doctrinaire instruction, but through your own evaluation informed by your lived experience as to what you believe. And college is the moment where those ideas can take flight. So our work focuses on college students, not in the classroom. We don't do grade disputes at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. If you come to us and say, I have a First Amendment right to get an A, I say, no, you don't. In your classroom, that is, and here we are in the School of Ed, right? In your classroom, that's the domain of the teacher. In fact, the teacher has a First Amendment academic freedom right to teach that class how he or she or they see fit. Off campus, now that is a different story, right? If you go off campus, whether you're in the community or whether you're on campus at large, particularly at a public university, we would argue that you enjoy full expressive rights, that you've obtained, by the time you graduate from high school, your driver's license for democracy. You are old enough to fight and die for your country. You're old enough no longer to be controlled by your parents in loco parentis, right? Even though they may still pay the bills. And you have a freedom, a First Amendment freedom to speak your mind at a public university, or a right to avail yourself of the promises made to you by your private institution. So that's where we come in. But boy, there's a lot to answer in that question. It's a good one.
We're all good. So let me ask you this. Do you think that there is an ideological or a political dimension to all of these campus free speech debates? And you remember that I just noted the Stanford situation where the student had satirized the thought to be conservative Federalist Society and got dinged for that. So do you think that there is an ideological dimension?
Yeah,
Lois, what do you think?
Absolutely.
Let's hear it.
Well, we have to understand that free speech is not totally free. And that means that somebody has to make decisions about what is protected and what is not. And that's when the political and the ideological issues come to play. I know that, for instance, I was arrested by a governor for unfurling, you mentioned unfurling a flag, for unfurling a flag that said no more prisons. Mm-hmm. So he was making a decision about what I could do and what I couldn't. And luckily, the court said he was wrong. so that
Sometimes we get it right, Alice.
Yes. But I think also in, on a campus, you have to recognize that these are great institutions, they're educational institutions, but they're also businesses. Mm-hmm. And so they make decisions sometimes based on whether it might offend a donor or someone else who has some political ties.
What about a parent paying $65,000 a year?
Right. So there's always these decisions being made about what is protected, and it has to be. I don't know. There's nothing objective. I know people talk about, we make decisions in an objective fashion. That's not true. I've never seen it happen, but we maintain that it is. But somebody's making a decision based on either their ideology or their political connections or concerns. So it's always there in whatever college or you happen to be, or whatever campus that you happen to be on.
Yes, ma'am. So Will, what has fire seen? Do you perceive an ideological or a political dimension to this?
Well, I'll say two things. First of all, again, I really echo those comments, right? The first and perhaps most underreported aspect of free speech conflicts on campus are students who are critical of their administration, or students who say something about the administration would rather not have in the public. And it's for that exact public relations, corporatization, bureaucratization reasons that Dr. Green referenced. But I will say this, when I introduced myself at a party, right? Remember parties. This is the most people I've been in a room with in a long time. So when I introduce myself and say, oh, what do you do? I say, I'm a First Amendment lawyer. They say, and they look at me. And in that moment, no matter what their own political commitment may be, I tell them, I can give you 5 instances of speech I've defended that would have you thinking I'm a freedom fighter. And I can also give you 5 instances of freedom of speech that I've defended that would have you think I'm the devil incarnate. I wake up defending pro-choice students, go to bed defending pro-life students, right? I've done both sides of Israel, Palestine, college, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Libertarians, Socialists, the whole deal. I think consistency counts.
And you would have been defending those Nazis who were marching and
the only time that my organization will editorialize about the speech we defend, and we will defend it. Our test is if it's protected under current case law, we defend it under our understanding of what it is. The one exception we'll make, the only time we'll editorialize is if people have an anti-First Amendment rally. We'll defend them, right? Just like those Nazis. The Nazis don't believe in the First Amendment, but we will say, these people are wrong, right? So that's the one time. Just the last note on this one. There is a greater cultural emphasis right now. When I was in high school and in grade school, free speech was cool amongst the left. I'm the son of a poet. My parents are politically on the left. I am FIRE's proudly nonpartisan. Right now, the energy amongst campus activists for free speech is on the right. There's a big media system on the right that identifies campus speech controversies and pumps them up. So we certainly defend a lot of conservative students. My frustration these days is when we defend liberal students. We just filed a lawsuit for a student who was denied recognition for his single-payer health care club, a medical student at a public med school in Virginia. And it didn't make any noise whatsoever. There's just not a passion on the left right now for defending freedom of speech. And so my worry is that if free speech gets politicized, like so much is in this current moment, I worry that we're in trouble. Free speech has to be an American value, a point taken from Dr. Green as to the objectivity and the illusion of it, but free speech has to be a commitment above partisan politics for it to mean anything. And that's, I think, my daily job now is to educate folks across the spectrum of the importance. Free speech is there. It's your right. If you get in trouble, give us a call and we'll defend you, no matter what you believe.
And to Will's point, when Pat Fox and I were in school, it was the Tinker era.
Right.
Everybody was protesting the Vietnam War. I see nodding heads. And so it was the left that was in favor of free speech, and that, perhaps. So, Oliver, what are you seeing in the secondary, elementary level? Are you seeing it from one side or the other? Are they the guys coming in with Trump flags, or are they coming in with Biden flags, or something else?
Well, it's certainly the polarized political perspectives are evident, period. And so you can see the difference from regions of state. And my school community happened to be even though this year I understand that a majority of folks actually voted for Biden, but it's a community that largely touted itself as being a Republican community, which is kind of an interesting dichotomy in that sense of it. And so, but what we're seeing is that not even necessarily about students, but how students are being used, quite frankly, as pawns to profess certain ideological differences. And we see it at board meetings where people are mask versus mask, vaccination versus max vaccination, critical race theory. So we see parents bringing kids in, and kids are using vocabulary that they don't even understand the bigger context of it. And so what we're often trying to do is get out of the conversation where people are arguing opinions to get into the conversation where students could understand facts and context. And so we try to, again, bring it back to the educational arena. And why that's important, because yes, while there are constraints on educators not, quote unquote, indoctrinating students, the hot political issues is very tempting for the teacher to say, well, this is what I believe. And the minute that happens, we have crossed the line as educators. And so how do we then foster that environment that say, yes, there are gaping political ideologies on the same issue, by the way. We can look at the same thing, significant different perspectives. And how do we bring it back into a context where the academic conversations around facts, around the case law, how does a case law, how does it interpret, what are factors? And so students have truly that sense of understanding of the issue, and not just what I believe, and I believe what I believe regardless of whatever is true. Back to what you're saying, sometimes truth doesn't matter in debates of that nature, and as a responsibility, we're trying to bring it back. Because we have seen the issues. We have seen the issue from gun safety, where we're talking about school safety and people want to turn into you're anti-gun. Well, we're not anti-gun, we're just anti-guns in schools. And so how do you bring it back to those reality becomes the challenge, right? Because then you're faced with what the community think about your action and how does it rub against their ideological beliefs. And that's the challenge, I think, because we often say we want to prepare kids to be global citizens, but the decisions have local impact.
Could I just add also
Please.
that students don't stay on campus all the time. And there's a perfect example that's happening right now in our community in Saratoga, where students are involved with Black Lives Matter campaigns and movement. And Saratoga, for some reason, the police department and the officials are concerned about Saratoga being seen as a safe area. Economically, they depend upon tourists, okay? So you can't have these Black Lives Matter people coming to town and making all this commotion. So what they're doing now is arresting, they were arresting students who were protesting and doing very small, minor kinds of things, but issuing warrants for their arrest. So the point is, politically, they want to chill, the speech of students, and they're doing it through this fashion.
Do you think that they would be doing the same thing if it was a Blue Lives Matter demonstration?
No, and because we're talking about an administration that is bent on making sure there is control. And police officers, police departments are seen as the way to control a lot of things, including speech. And so when we talk about Blue Lives Matter, that's really an effort to diminish the Black Lives Matter message. And so I think it would be very different because police are representing all of those wealthy people, all of those politicians who want to make sure they control the city by keeping these loud students and others out of the main drag in the community.
And so do you think it's the political views of Saratoga, or is it their commercial interest in tourism?
Yeah, well, both. Yes, it's very much the commercial, the economic piece is very, very strong. And so you have to, if you're part of the administration, you have to make sure that Saratoga is seen as a safe place. So it's political, it's economical as well.
What about the differences that we have seen in the murder rate over the last year? Does that play any part in how people are reacting to the police now?
Oh.
I mean, so the communities of color
Right.
are where are the people who are suffering, as far as I can tell.
Well, yes, but they're also stereotyped as being criminal and violent. And so you react to that. The police department always reacts. The police department basically functions by using stereotypes. And so, yes, there's an issue regarding violence, but it's not on an individual basis. We're not looking at some of the social issues and circumstances that play a role in that violence. The point is simply control, and that's what they want to do.
Okay. Do we have views? All of them.
I want to share, again, Dr. Green's point is very valid in many ways, because I often say that, if people don't think that being black in America and being a black male in America is a challenge, I would ask any white person to change roles with me for a day, and probably everyone would say no. And they probably add a few words in front of that might violate St. Rose free speech. And so I say that in a sense because that's also part of the reality of the society. So with that being at a point, I draw back to the responsibility of institution of learning, be it higher ed or K-12. That certainly we want to create environments and opportunities and experiences for our young people. Hopefully we're not raising the next generation of bigots or whatever, versus we want to create environments where young people are compassionate. Young people have a global perspective. Young people have not only understanding of themselves, but also a greater appreciation of others. And yes, it's not pie in the sky for thinking or being idealistic, but I think that's a tremendous role that education plays. And when you think about a democratic society, that's what makes the engine goes, right? Educated populace. And so how do we do so in a way that hopefully some of these conflicts, societal conflicts that we see that often comes from capitalism, the bottom line dollar, or quite frankly, with your ignorance in some instances of people one to the other. How do we try to negate that by creating environments, and back to your first question, that young people could sit and talk and say, you know what, I may have a difference in your opinion, but I don't necessarily hate you for your opinion. I just don't agree with your opinion, and here's why. And help me understand why you have your opinion, and hopefully, again, we move to the center of conversations. Unfortunately, back to your second piece about the ideological differences, it has done this. So there's no middle lane anymore. It's either right lane or left lane, and there's no middle where, quite frankly, we always say objectivity is where decisions take place, right? That's where we live here. We hang out here once in a while, we hang out here once in a while, but we all live here. And so I think that's a tremendous benefit of institutional learning, and I think it's a new role that, be it K-12 or higher ed, has to take on. It has to become a part of the mantra, part of the mission, to say, how do we have a sense of responsibility to provide our young people these opportunities to unpack those differences, unpack those ideologies in ways that be constructive at the end of the day, and avoid this destructive power play that we see playing out all over the place.
Let me ask you this question. We have seen around the country efforts to ban critical race theory and the 1619 Project. Couple of questions. Number one, does that threaten the First Amendment? And number two, how do you foster a constructive discussion rather than what some are characterizing as indoctrination? I'm telling you this country started in 1619, it was because of slavery. How do you foster that?
So it's interesting because we're dealing with it. So I get people say, I'm against CRT, and I jokingly say, okay, which aspect are you against, critical race theory or cultural responsive teaching? First, let's unpack that. What are you really for or against? And so that's the first piece I ask, because oftentimes, at least in my experience, when I either get the nasty emails or otherwise, the individual on the other end is very, very ignorant about what they're really talking about. And so once we start unpacking that, and certainly I think my friend Will could even go more in terms of the legal framework that the critical race theory comes from, I say that one of the things that we can't deny that racism is a part of the DNA of this country. The fact that we still have record in our Constitution that defines someone less than is an indication of that. And so how do we then start even simple things as changing our vocabulary? Instead of people being slaves, no one chose to be a slave, they were enslaved. And so how do we start changing the vocabulary that subsequently start changing the perspective, particularly for our young people? They don't have to carry the baggage of prior generations' ignorance moving forward. And I think that's a responsibility we have in education. So how do we start having those conversations without placing blame? And I think that's the fear, right? People think if we should bring the word race up, and I always joke that people think like race only belongs to black people, but we all have a racial demarcation, period, but yet one doesn't debate, one does, right? And so I always so we start those conversations by pointing out, if you will, some of the idiocy and some of the logic that goes on both sides of the arguments. And then we start talking about, then ultimately, what do we really want for our kids? Do you, as a parent, want your child to be someone that the proverbial knows your name? And the reason why I say knows your name, because once I know your name, Loretta, I now have to reconcile how I think and feel about you. If I don't know your name, you can become indifferent very quickly. So how do we ensure that the young people in our schools and our classrooms, that we try to understand them, understand their differences, understand the things they bring to the table, and hopefully we create an environment. And that's what we're talking about. The whole culturally responsive piece is, how do we in fact take the time to do so? How do we take the time to interrogate our own thinking as adults
Well, and
as well?
that's the question. And Will, you were invited into this conversation by Oliver. What are you seeing in terms of efforts that school districts or universities are making to encourage free and open conversation?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
It's a good question. Judge, at the higher ed level, my attorneys have been busy for the past 6 to 9 months testifying in state houses against some of these broad bans of critical race theory that we've seen introduced nationwide. We're First Amendment advocates. We believe in more speech, not less. We are inherently suspicious of any efforts to ban teaching of certain subjects. The case law back to 1957, Sweezy v. New Hampshire, when the state of New Hampshire's Attorney General hauls in for questioning at the height of McCarthyism, at the height of the Red Scare, a Marxist economist named Paul Sweezy, and they demand that he answer questions about what he's teaching these impressionable youth. And in 1957, no easy thing, sitting on 3 decades of anti-communist case law, including cases that we would say now are just flatly wrongly decided on First Amendment grounds against the speakers, the First Amendment stood up and said, if we put any straitjackets on the future leaders and the teachers in the classrooms, we imperil the future of this country. So we are adamantly opposed to efforts to restrict what teachers can say in the classrooms. At the K-12 level, the legal landscape is different. K-12 teachers act in loco parentis, to use the Supreme Court's phrase. This is the verb that echoes around in my head all the time. They are charged with inculcating the values of civilized society. Now, obviously, there's a lot of play in those joints, right? One person's civilized society can be another person's, a fascist regime, or another person's dystopian nightmare, etc. There's not a lot of agreement these days on what a civilized society would be, let alone what the values thereof might look like. So at the K-12 level, we've seen stories of teachers going too far and attempting, I think, to start thoughtful dialogues, but instead telling students that they are born into X role and that's where they are as a function of their race. And we would be nervous about that as well. But I think the ultimate answer, and this, speaking of sounding idealistic, but I think this is the only way out, right, is more speech, more dialogue, not less. To Oliver's good point about the lanes, right, meet in the middle. We are sponsoring right now something we call the Let's Talk initiative, where we're trying to set up forums where students can talk about hot-button issues without fear of going viral or being snapshotted or whatever. Some place where you can actually talk things out. Last thing I'll say, one of the best classes I had as an undergrad at NYU was taught by someone who I disagreed with politically completely. And he charged me, it was a public policy class, he charged me with making the argument on what to do with Social Security benefits, and it was different than what I thought should be done. But lo and behold, I had to research my opponent's position. I had to figure out exactly what the strong points of the argument were. I learned a lot because I'd only been talking to people that agreed with me, right? So once I started reading the smart people from the other side, I didn't agree with them. I still agree with where I was, but I was that much better equipped to have an actual conversation across difference. Again, sounds idealistic. In some ways, easy for me to say, I'm 40, I'm out of school, you folks are in it. You know better than I do what it's like to be a college student these days. But that's the hope, right? That's the lodestar that I think we need to continue to push to.
But I think it's gotten really so bad. The critical race theory issue has gotten so bad that I noticed that we're no longer, we're trying to get people not to use it, to change the terminology here. I just happened to notice that the New York Civil Liberties Union is sponsoring a discussion on the 12th. Yeah, I think it's on the 12th. And we're talking about it as teaching racial justice, because that term has gotten such terrible reaction from people now. They see that we're trying to call them racist if you mention using critical race theory as an issue. And so I'm hopeful that more groups like the Civil Liberties Union will sponsor these kinds of discussions about really racial justice. I mean, that's what it is teaching racial justice, so that we can sort of, get away from the problem that terminology is causing.
Let me ask a broader question. What advice do you all give to students who believe that any and all hurtful or disrespectful words, or anything that upsets the listener, should be sanctioned? Essentially, what is hate speech? Who gets to decide? Is it anything that just offends you and makes you uncomfortable? Or is it somebody calling you a racist or a bigot or a fascist or something? How do we deal with that? Are we snowflakes? And who gets to decide? Sir.
So I feel like we have several cases that set precedents for what could be determined hate speech. Schenck versus U.S. first outlined that anything that could cause an injury or lead to injury is no longer allowed. As we all know, if you yell fire in a crowded room, that is not allowed. That is not allowed. It is a violation of that. It is outside the scope of the First Amendment. So that could be quantified as hate speech. Anything that could be injurious towards another person. We have several other cases that build off on that, such as Brandenburg versus Ohio, which protected any speech unless it could directly and imminently influence lawless activity. And then there's Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, which also said the First Amendment does not protect fighting words, which could cause injury or cause an immediate breach of peace. So in conclusion, anything that could cause an injury to another person or result in a person committing an act that could cause injury would be considered hate speech.
So some of these school speech codes go way beyond that, to be disrespectful to another student. What do you all think of that? Yes, ma'am. The microphone always has to go from one side of the room to the other side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
I think when it comes to this topic, I think going back to what Dr. Oliver said, there's no middle ground, and when it comes to disrespectful speech or hate speech, I think people need to learn to think in a higher level without using slanderous terms or disrespectful speech. They need to be able to voice their opinion, backing up using their thought process and their facts instead of just throwing disrespectful terms out. They need to learn how to voice their opinion without offending someone else. It goes back to what he was saying about the left or the right. this generation is terrible about having a middle ground. You need to be able to see someone else's opinion without being offended. You need to be able to respect their opinion as well, to learn and think highly of someone else.
What do you say to your classmate who says, what that person just said to me really hurts me? It's not going to hurt you physically. It's not going to disrupt the school. But you say, I am really hurt by that, and I think that she ought to be sanctioned. What do you say to that person?
I think that people bring their feelings and opinions into politics a lot, and there's not a huge place for them because when it comes to facts and opinions, they're two different things. So I think that whatever was said is factual and it has a good basis of an argument, then her opinions aren't really important. Her personal opinions aren't as important as how factual or important what the person trying to get across is.
Where the person, the angry parent emailing Oliver, doesn't really know what he or she is talking about.
Right, exactly. I think people need to take into consideration that sometimes facts are going to hurt their feelings, and that's how politics are.
Well, let me ask you this, and all of you. How do you go about fostering that kind of exchange? How do you try to teach both the school community and the community? Number one, hurtful speech is hurtful speech, and maybe we just shouldn't be doing that. And on the other hand, free exchange of ideas is a good value. Sir.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
I really...
Thanks.
Thank you.
You think just because you're up that high, you can spelt it out.
I suppose I thought I could project, but I'll try.
Thank you.
Yes. Can I just get the question one more time, please?
Essentially, how can we lower the temperature? How can we encourage the kind of discussion that this lady over here was talking about in taking it away from your personal views and going to something more fact-based, just what Will was talking about with the Social Security issue? How can we lower the temperature?
Yes, ma'am. I really enjoyed this comparison, actually, having some type of knowledge. I believe it's on the same level as, some historical concepts that are not essentially taught enough for people to understand, and I believe it comes from a stance of ignorance, if you will. So I think that accountability and respect for each other needs to be taught as well, just like in school and in society, because I feel like that oftentimes you don't see that in just regular day-to-day interactions, holding the door for someone or, helping an elderly person with, whatever it may be. So I believe that it stems all from that, and if accountability is on a greater level, I believe that, a common ground can be found, a compromise, if you will.
How can we foster better dialogue within the college community? How can we help that and lower the temperature and go more toward a fact-based discussion? Does it depend on the students? Does it depend on the professor?
I believe that it's everyone together. I think it's more of an intervention, and if, everybody, it has to be a collective effort. I believe that's the only way that it'll work, and it's just reaching an understanding. I understand that not everybody will agree. However, I think it needs to be talked about and discussed, and for people to understand and think about it so they can have their own facts or their own opinions, and then a common ground can be reached.
Could I just say that you mentioned history?
Yes.
I think that's very important, especially for African American students. They're very, very sensitive because we've had a long history of hate being directed against us. So one of the important things is to understand the whole history of that relationship with the white community. So we have to look at that from that period of enslavement up to the current time. This is one of the reasons why we at the Center for Law and Justice try to push police officers to actually incorporate in their training civil rights history, because it's really, really important to know that. So black students are having a really difficult time because we've almost become paranoid and sensitive to things that people say that you might not understand. But if you understand the history of that relationship, then you can better understand where they're coming from. So I think we have to do a lot more of that on the college campus as well as in the community. But I think you're right when you talked about the history.
What else? Who else? How are we going to, yes, ma'am. The lady over here, please.
Sorry.
Lady with the good glasses.
Thank you.
And you're allowed to question the panelists, by the way. I didn't tell them that before, but you're allowed.
I just wanted to build off of what we said earlier. I do think in order for us to foster some of these,
Belt it out, belt it out.
in order to foster more of these topics such as race and diversity within our community, I do think that we all it's an underline of respect from both parties no matter what is said. Like, of course, I'm not going to always agree with whatever the next person is saying, but I still have to respect that they have a different opinion. We all must understand and actually listen to what somebody is saying rather than just attacking them. And I do think that we all do need an underline of respect for each other, such as, pronouns, race, just respecting and trying to understand what everybody's saying, because we won't get anywhere in any of our conversations if we don't have some type of underlying of respect for each other.
What are concrete things we can do in the college community to help that process along?
So I would say having a sit down just where we can all express ourselves, and I do agree that teaching the younger generations more about their history, more about what is happening, because America is still very young. We're not perfect. We were never perfect. We have to get better. That is why we need to have these conversations with each other and teach the younger generation to be better than what we are now, because even now, our generation, we are not perfect, of course. So I think that's just, we need to teach ourselves. And as, what was said before about facts, I think we do need to have more facts, but we cannot have every fact if we are not being taught. We can't have all the facts if we are not being taught this at a younger age. I think we need to teach people more about the facts at a younger age, such as like elementary school or middle school. So whenever somebody is in around high school and college age, we can start to form our own opinion with these facts that we've gathered so far within our lives and learn more facts about certain topics that we are interested in.
Will, tell me what it's called again, sifting and
winnowing.
Sifting and winnowing. May I just interrupt for 1 minute? I wanted to ask the president about the conversations that you have convened. Could you just describe that, and then I want to go to the lady in the back. Because do we have the purple memo, miss, or do you have a black dress on? Is your dress purple also?
No.
No, it's, I can't see. Marcia, could you give the president the microphone, please? Just to this lady's point about conversations.
Well, I shared this with a friend earlier today, that after the George Floyd murder, we immediately knew that we needed to start listening and having the opportunity to hear how people felt, how it impacted them. You don't take action until you listen and you hear. And actually what I'm going to do is to ask Yolanda Caldwell. Is Yolanda here? Right after that, we began a series of actually weekly conversations. Then we brought Yolanda Caldwell in, and she became our Chief Diversity Officer. And while we were bringing her in, just before we brought her in, I wanted to see what are the reporting policies. And I looked at them, and I said, you've got to be kidding me. These aren't sufficient, they don't do what we need to do, it doesn't give our students an opportunity to express or report issues that they're facing. And then we brought Yolanda in, and we made a decision that we would have monthly open conversations about different topics. And we knew that there needed to be training sessions in the college community. We want you all to have a voice. It's part of your education to find out who you are. That's probably more important than anything you're going to learn, is who you are, what you stand for, and what you believe in. But first, people have to listen, and they have to listen respectfully, and I'm really, really happy to hear that. You have to respect everyone in their opinion, and sometimes you have to educate them about why they may feel that way. But I want to hand this over to Yolanda because she's done a fabulous job. And this is the passion we have. This is hopefully one of the things that I will be most proud of when I leave this college, that we listened to you, we gave you an opportunity, and we're all learning from you.
Hope you didn't mind my letting the president go ahead of you.
Thank you, Judge Prescott. What I wanted to do is share with you when you asked the question, what are we doing here? And I want to thank each one of you who shared, because what you said helped me realize we may need to do a little more. We started with the community conversations, and we have 3 pillars that we use with the collective trauma recovery framework, which is active listening, speaking from the heart, and acting with. And if you're not able to share that means I'm not doing my job in making sure that you have that information and understand how to do that. So one of the things that I'm going to commit to you as students to the St. Rose community is that we're going to put more effort in helping you understand how to do that training, because we have adopted that here at the college, and we need to do more work to make sure that you understand and you learn those skills so that you can actively listen, speak from your heart, and act with. And with those skills, we believe that you can have that dialogue. You can have that opportunity to learn from each other, because everyone has a different lived experience. And we can learn history, but you can also learn from each other based on the experiences that you have. So I want to thank you for being here so that I can learn that I need to do something to help you. And I hope that when we offer the sessions that you come out, and I definitely want to work with the mock trial team to do some of that training.
Thank you. Who else? Who else? Yes, ma'am. Sir. Ma'am, stand up. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Just going off your original question, I think what's really important with the whole opinion versus fact is that, going off of what Dr. Green said especially, is that because of everything that's happening and everything that we now see is wrong with our nation and our community as a whole, there's been this big bridge of emotionality and opinion. And because of this emotionality that's been brought into our opinions, because we feel so deeply about certain things, I think we lose where we need to stop and look at what we're trying to put across and not let our emotions deal with it. Because I also feel like a large deal of this emotionality comes from not knowing everybody's side. And I have the honor of being taught by Professor Chaplow and Dr. Farnham. And a large part of our classes and our discussion is about current policy and what we can do to change it for the better. And I think I've had great other students in just like Jacob and so many people from mock trial that I know hold this same wanting to do better and wanting to improve things. And I know that we see it as well as a lot of people in this room, I think, see that a big way that we need to foster change is to look within ourselves first to see what we need to change within ourselves first, but also what we need to help change in the community around us. And at this level of respect and at this level of understanding that everybody comes from a different situation, and no matter where you're coming from, there's something that you have to say, and there's some opinion that you have to share with the world. And whether they be correct or not, it's through those opinions that we must lead and understand how to better ourselves. But I think that
one of our biggest stopping points is that emotionality, that we need to take, though we need to look within ourselves, we also need to take ourselves out of the equation because it's not always about us. And that we need to look at these problems from a point of logic, because no help has come from somebody screaming what they think is right. Where change happens is when people are able to sit down and look at each other and be like, hey, you have this opinion, I have this opinion, this is the thing that's going wrong. Where can we bridge ourselves to better make this problem and solve it? And I think that emotionality, though it's good to have that like fire, I guess, to want change, it also gets in our way. And that's just a human quality. That we want to change things so badly, we want everything to be right, we want it to be perfect, but it's not perfect. And it's through that balance of emotionality and logic and knowing where you're coming from and knowing where other people are coming from that we will truly see some of that change.
Who else? Yes, sir. The gentleman in the front, please.
Abby makes such a great point talking about taking your emotions out of your class. I don't think the question is whether or not we should have opinions within the class. It's what kind of opinions are allowed in the class. Are they factually backed? Are they accurate? Are they relying on good argumentation? Are they not contradicting themselves? Because in college, it's not about we shouldn't have opinions in the classroom, because we should. We learn from each other's opinions. One of my classes right now, the politics of whiteness, is taught by Professor Strauss, and she does an amazing job of allowing the class to guide the discussion through our opinions, but it's based on the facts that we've read ahead of us. And if something is incorrect, we get corrected by one of our fellow classmates, but in a very respectful manner. We don't all agree politically, we don't have the same views or beliefs. We've been studying to develop different views, and we're learning from each other. So opinions are, I think, imperative to have in the classroom, because it allows us to expand our own perspectives by viewing another person's opinion. But the most important part is that you base it on facts and logic. It has to be backed by, without contradicting yourself. Because if you start contradicting yourself, it leads into becoming incorrect and not factual.
Exactly. We have time for one more, right there in the back, please. Thank you, Miss.
I guess mine's not so much of a comment as more as a question to be posed. We've talked a lot about opinions and having those opinions backed by facts. And we live in a society now where the media will take the same news headline, but each platform will write it in a different way. So I guess my question is, how do we discern actual facts versus facts that aren't necessarily the truth?
Right. I think that's the million-dollar question, right? Whose fact are you're referring to? And oftentimes, we even go to case law. What does the case law says? And we may not agree with it, but that's the structure that made a decision on it in terms of then we'll use it for the basis for whatever decision we have to make. And it is a fine line. That's always the fine line. And I think that's the beauty of education. It's a discovery process. And it's a process where things change as a result of new discoveries, new perspective. And how do we then provide the voice and the venue for our young people to be empowered, to have a sense of agency, to have a sense of their voice matters in the equation as well. And if we foster that, then every young people's voice matter. And the whole notion of disrespect and hurt is not the issue. The issue is growth and advancement in terms of leaning into the discomfort of some of the conversations, which is often sometimes we're not trained to do. And so how do we change that as a framework in terms of how we look at what institutions of learning provides to our young people? Great safe space for the evolution of growth to take place.
Exactly. Alice, how do we get to discern the facts?
Right. And there are other ways, there are other mediums for having those kinds of discussion other than in the classroom. I'm always trying to get students out in the community because I think that's very important. For instance, one of the things that we did was to set up, right after the George Floyd killing, we set up a community Time for Reckoning website, which is really interesting because people now are contributing ideas and thoughts that they're having discussions in the community through that medium. And I think we have to look for other ways of doing it. We're also doing things with young people through the arts, that they're doing these murals all over town, expressing their ideas and their thoughts about issues around racism and getting along with other people. So we need to branch out and look for other ways of expression and also learning from other people.
Will, how do we sift and win?
How do you sit and wait? I think my boss has good advice. Find the smartest person who disagrees with you and talk to them, right? And keep talking, as much dialogue as possible. I couldn't do this job if I wasn't an optimist. I couldn't do this job if I didn't think ultimately, may take a long time. In fact, I think it will. But some truth will out. And I think that the history of social progress in this country shows that. I really like Dr. Robinson's point about leaning into discomfort, right? We have a saying at FIRE, if you go through college for 4 years and you're not once offended or challenged, you don't have your beliefs challenged, you should ask for your money back. And that's not because offense is fun. It's hard, no matter who you are. And that's not to be ignorant of the history behind why someone might feel that offense, but that's the first step. It's not the last step, right? Offense in our pluralistic democracy, which takes on so many different types of folks in it, is inevitable. That's the start. It's what happens next, right? It's the question. There is no First Amendment exception for hate speech. The government is not coming to save you from people saying things that are going to make you feel awful. What will ultimately out is your strength as an individual. None of us are too weak to live with freedom of speech. The First Amendment is for all of us. So with sifting and winnowing, take in as much information as you can. You have to be, I love the phrase active listener. You have to be an active listener, but not just to people who agree with you, to other folks, and interrogate, right? And then keep going, keep going. And last but not least, this is something I try to practice every day with my 6-year-old and 4-year-old, a little epistemic humility. None of us are perfect. None of us have all the answers. I'm not religious, but I love the phrase, God isn't finished with me, right? Because everybody has to keep working every day to recognize and not be arrogant, not to think, I've got the answers, that person is wrong. They may be wrong, but talk to them, right? Maybe you're wrong too. So that's it.
And with that, let me just say one more thing. We've had, I think, a good discussion tonight about one of the pillars of this country. And to my friend's point that we are a young country, and to my friend's point here that we have to keep getting better. That's what this country is. We are still young, we are still evolving. Of course we have issues, but we are the best country in the world. Thank you for coming tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Would you help me thank our panelists?
Thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you. I appreciate all you did. Just listen to your biography. That's incredible. Holy moly, I got tired of just listening to it. Well, I'm honored to see you. That's awesome. Thank you. I just stuck with FIRE, so I've been reading some stuff about it. Yeah. I really appreciate what you do different. We can ever, students that you're working with, send them my way. Let me see if I can have a card just to have it. That would be great.